I was at a conference the other week at the University of Huddersfield, and we had a couple of historians who were presenting papers about the Jerusalemite kingdoms, which were fantastically interesting. There's one paper in particular focused on the Chronicle of William of Tyre, who records this one incident where Godfrey IV, the leper king, who's very famous from a film featuring Orlando Bloom, is supposed to have ridden into battle and cut a man in half with his sword. And this is a very masculine thing to do. It's something that crops up quite a lot in medieval literature. Is this warrior, this knight, this kingly person is so much better at fighting than everyone else that he just cuts a man in half. It's a bit of a trope in some types of medieval literature. And the question I'm interested in is it possible? So, to phrase this very broadly, first thing you have to understand is what types of weapons are available. And in the 12th century, there are generally three types of weapons. There are stabby things, there are cutty things, and there are things like the halberd, which is a bit of everything mixed into one. And the first point to take away from that is that stabby things like spears, are really bad at cutting people in half. They're very, very good at stabbing someone, but terrible at cutting. Next thing, an obvious point that follows on, cutty things like swords are very, very good at cutting people. Right? It is entirely possible to do a lot of damage to someone with a sword. Problem is that people who are going into battle are ready for that. They're aware of the propensity to get hurt, so they tend to take precautions like wearing armour. And that renders a lot of things like swords a lot less effective than they would otherwise be. In fact, if you're wearing something like plate armour, a sword tends not to be a particularly good weapon to use against that. That's why a lot of the treatises that survive from the medieval period show people who are fighting with swords using them as giant levers and crowbars to wrestle with rather than to actually cut someone. Now, there are swords that did cut people in half. However, they tend not to have been battle swords. The swords that we have that survive from Europe tend to be executioner's swords. In Japan, exactly the same thing. They used to use katanas to execute prisoners. That would be the test of the blade when they'd forge a new katana. But because it was a test of the blade rather than of the sword design, when they were using katanas to execute prisoners, they'd add an extra long handle. The handle that a battlefield katana would have, as opposed to an executioner's katana, is much, much shorter. It produces much less leverage. So when you're executing a prisoner, you tend to have a bigger, heavier sword, or a longer handle, or both. And you also have the added advantage that the person is strapped down because they're there to be executed and they're not wearing any armour. In a battlefield situation, you'd be fighting someone who is moving, desperately trying to protect themselves, and probably wearing armour. And you'd also have a much smaller sword. You'd have a battlefield sword. It would be your sidearm. You would tend to go into war with a spear or a halberd or a bec de corban or something of that ilk, a war weapon, something that you're ready to fight with. You wouldn't generally walk into war with just your sword, because in this period, swords aren't the most effective weapons. So this idea that Godfrey could come along and be very, very masculine, and in the middle of a battle he just draws his sword and he cuts someone on a horse in half, I don't buy it. I think it's a trope, I think it's a literary feature, I think it's used to show how good he's meant to be at fighting and therefore to stress the virtue of his kingship. What is much more likely to happen is that someone who's on a gigantic warhorse comes charging at you and then they ride over you and you're left with hoofprints on your face. Because you just don't cut people who are wearing battle armour in half. It just doesn't happen. So the answer on this one is no, I'm afraid.